The patient's heart monitor was showing 30 beats per minute, maybe less. Her liver was failing catastrophically, blood pressure dropping by the second. Every senior surgeon in the room had already given up. Time of death, 9:47 p.m., the chief resident started to say. But I had been working on a cellular regeneration technique for 7 years, a completely unprecedented approach to organ failure that existed only in my lab notebooks and animal trials. It had never been attempted on a human being, never received FDA approval, never been anything more than theoretical possibility and scientific obsession. And if I used it now, if I tried to save this woman's life with experimental stem cell therapy, I would certainly lose my medical license, probably face criminal charges, and definitely destroy the career I'd spent 15 years building. But looking at that monitor and her 2 teenage daughters sobbing in the waiting room, I made a choice that would change everything. I didn't spend a decade in medical school to watch people die when I knew I could save them. Dr. Jennifer Zhao was going to survive this night, even if it meant I'd never practice medicine again. Before I tell you what happened in that operating room, drop a comment and let me know. Would you risk everything you've worked for to save someone's life? Have you ever chosen what was right over what was allowed? Your stories matter to us. My hands were steady as I prepared the injection that would either revolutionize medicine or end my career. My name is Dr. Sarah Kim, and at 34 years old, I was the youngest department head in cardiac research at Stanford Medical Center. Youngest ever tenured professor, most cited researcher in regenerative medicine, holder of 16 patents in cellular therapy. I had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Medical School, completed dual fellowships in cardiology and molecular biology, and spent every moment since then obsessed with one impossible goal: teaching the human body to heal itself at the cellular level. My life's work was stem cell cardiac repair, finding ways to regenerate heart tissue that everyone said was permanently damaged. And I was close, so close that I could feel the breakthrough just beyond my reach. But breakthroughs require risks, and Dr. Jennifer Zhao became the moment when theory had to become reality. She arrived at our emergency room on a Wednesday night, her heart in complete failure from a rare autoimmune condition that had destroyed 70% of her cardiac muscle. 42 years old, mother of 2 teenage daughters, celebrated violinist with the San Francisco Symphony. She had been sick for 6 months, getting progressively worse despite every conventional treatment we could offer. Her heart was essentially dying, cell by cell, and the waiting list for a transplant was 18 months long. She didn't have 18 days. I'd been following her case from the beginning, consulting with her primary cardiologist about possible experimental treatments. But everything I suggested was blocked by hospital administration, by ethics committees, by the endless bureaucracy that protects institutions more than it protects patients. Too risky, they said. Not enough human trials, they said. Wait for FDA approval, they said. While we waited, Jennifer Zhao was dying. That Wednesday night, her heart finally gave up completely. Cardiac arrest, no response to standard resuscitation, brain activity fading fast. The attending physician had already called her family into the room to say goodbye. Her daughters, Emma and Lily, 16 and 14 years old, were holding their mother's hands and begging her not to leave them. I was in my lab when I got the page. Code Blue, ER3, patient Zhao, Jennifer. No response to standard intervention. I ran down 4 flights of stairs because waiting for the elevator would have taken precious seconds. When I burst into that emergency room, I saw exactly what I'd feared. A brilliant woman dying from a condition that should have been treatable, surrounded by doctors who had given up because they couldn't think beyond their training. Dr. Kim, the chief resident, said when he saw me, "We've done everything we can. It's not time for anything except saving her life," I interrupted. "Get me a crash cart, prep her for intracardiac injection, and someone call my lab, and have them bring down the experimental stem cell protocol I've been working on." The room went silent. Every doctor, every nurse, every medical professional in that emergency room knew exactly what I was proposing, and they all knew it was absolutely forbidden. "Dr. Kim," the chief resident said carefully, "that protocol hasn't been approved for human use. If you proceed with an unauthorized experimental treatment, if I proceed, a woman lives. If I don't, she dies. Seems like a pretty simple choice to me." But it wasn't simple at all, and everyone in that room knew it. The stem cell regeneration protocol I'd developed was revolutionary, potentially the biggest breakthrough in cardiac medicine in 50 years. I'd spent 7 years developing it, tested it successfully on animal models, published preliminary research in every major medical journal. The results were astounding. Complete cardiac tissue regeneration in subjects with previously irreparable damage. But human trials required approvals that took years to obtain. Institutional review boards, FDA protocols, safety studies, phase trials. The bureaucratic process that stood between my research and actual patients would take at least 5 more years to complete. Maybe 10. Jennifer Zhao didn't have 5 years. She didn't have 5 hours. "I need consent from the family," I said. "Someone get her daughters in here." Emma and Lily Zhao entered the treatment room minutes later, their faces showing the kind of grief that only children losing a parent can understand. I explained the situation in terms they could comprehend. Their mother was dying. Standard medicine had nothing left to offer, but I had developed a treatment that might save her life. "What are the risks?" Emma asked. At 16, she was already showing the practical intelligence her mother was famous for. Total organ failure, brain damage, immediate death, or she could make a complete recovery. Honestly, I don't know what will happen. This treatment has never been used on a human being before. "What happens if you don't try?" Lily asked. Your mother dies." "Tonight, within the hour." The sisters looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that siblings develop. Then Emma turned to me and said 5 words that would change medical history. "Do whatever you need to do." I had them sign consent forms that my lawyer had drafted for exactly this scenario, documents acknowledging the experimental nature of the treatment and absolving me of liability if things went wrong. Not that those forms would protect me if hospital administration decided to press charges, but at least the family wouldn't sue me for trying to save a life. The next 30 minutes were the most intense of my medical career. I administered the stem cell injection directly into Jennifer's failing heart, using a protocol I'd memorized from thousands of hours of research and simulation. The procedure itself was elegant in its simplicity. Harvest the patient's own stem cells, program them to become cardiac muscle cells, inject them directly into the damaged tissue, and hope that the body's natural healing processes would take over. Simple in theory, absolutely terrifying in practice. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Jennifer's heart rate remained critically low, her blood pressure continued dropping, and every monitor in the room screamed warnings that she was slipping away. The other doctors watched in silence, some with skepticism, others with barely concealed disapproval, a few with genuine hope. Then, at minute 12, something extraordinary happened. Jennifer's heart rate ticked up, just 1 beat per minute, but it was an increase. Then 2 beats, then 5. Her blood pressure began to stabilize. Color returned to her face. Brain activity on the EEG monitor showed strengthening patterns. At minute 20, her eyes opened. At minute 30, she was asking for her daughters. By morning, Jennifer Zhao's heart was functioning at 70% capacity, better than it had been in 6 months. The stem cells were integrating into her cardiac tissue, regenerating the muscle that her autoimmune condition had destroyed. Scans showed new cell growth in areas that had been considered permanently damaged. I had done the impossible. I had saved a life using a treatment that existed nowhere in medical literature. And for about 12 hours, I felt like I'd changed the world. Then hospital administration found out what I'd done. The meeting in the hospital director's office was predictable in its hostility. Dr. Marcus Wellington, the chief medical officer, sat behind his massive desk with a stack of paperwork documenting my violations of hospital protocol, medical ethics, and FDA regulations. The hospital's legal team flanked him on either side, their expressions making it clear that they saw me as a liability that needed to be eliminated. "Dr. Kim," Wellington began, his voice cold with professional disdain, "you performed an unauthorized experimental procedure on a patient without proper approval from any regulatory body. You used materials that have not been cleared for human use. You exposed this hospital to enormous legal liability, and you did all of this in direct violation of explicit instructions from your superiors." "I saved a woman's life," I replied, "a woman who would have died if I'd followed your rules." "Medicine doesn't work that way," Wellington said. "We have protocols and procedures for a reason. Individual physicians don't get to decide which rules apply to them, even when those rules cost lives. Even then, because the alternative is chaos. If every doctor did whatever they thought was right, regardless of regulations, we'd have no safety standards, no accountability, no way to protect patients from experimental treatments that might harm them." Jennifer Zhao wasn't harmed, she was healed. Wellington leaned forward, his expression hardening. "This time. But what about next time? What about the patient who doesn't survive your experimental treatment? What about the family who sues this hospital because we allowed a rogue physician to practice unauthorized medicine?" "I'm not a rogue physician. I'm a researcher who found a treatment that works." "You're a physician who violated federal law," the hospital's lead attorney interrupted. "The FDA has regulations about experimental treatments for excellent reasons. What you did wasn't just against hospital policy, it was potentially criminal." The meeting lasted 2 hours. They reviewed every aspect of my misconduct, documented every rule I'd broken, and made it clear that Stanford Medical Center could not continue to employ someone who had such flagrant disregard for institutional authority. I was terminated effective immediately. My lab was shut down, my research materials confiscated, my hospital credentials revoked. Security escorted me from the building like I was some kind of criminal, while colleagues I'd worked with for years watched from doorways and windows, too afraid of their own careers to speak up in my defense. Within a week, the California Medical Board opened an investigation into my conduct. The hospital reported me to every professional organization I belonged to. Articles appeared in medical journals debating whether I was a visionary or a dangerous maverick. Other hospitals quietly removed my job applications from consideration. I was blacklisted from academic medicine, unemployable at any major research institution, and facing possible license suspension for practicing experimental medicine without authorization. Jennifer Zhao, meanwhile, made a complete recovery. Her heart function returned to normal within 3 months. The stem cell treatment I'd developed had successfully regenerated her cardiac tissue, curing a condition that should have been fatal. She returned to her position with the symphony, playing violin at a level she hadn't reached in years. Her daughters had their mother back. But nobody in the medical establishment wanted to talk about that. They wanted to talk about protocols and regulations and the importance of following proper procedures. For 2 years, I survived on consulting work and speaking fees, telling my story at medical conferences to audiences, divided between those who thought I was a hero and those who thought I was reckless. I published research papers about the stem cell treatment, documenting Jennifer's recovery, and proposing clinical trials that no institution would fund. Those 2 years were the hardest of my life. I lived in a small apartment in Oakland, working at a community health clinic 3 days a week because it was the only place that would hire someone with my controversial reputation. The clinic served mostly uninsured immigrants and low-income families who couldn't afford mainstream healthcare. It was a world away from the cutting-edge research labs at Stanford. My typical day started at 5 a.m., reviewing medical journals to stay current with developments in my field. By 7 a.m., I'd be at the clinic, seeing patients with diabetes, hypertension, and routine ailments that any first-year resident could handle. The work was important, but it wasn't advancing medicine. It wasn't saving lives in the way I knew I was capable of. My colleagues from Stanford stopped returning my calls entirely. Former research partners who had collaborated on publications suddenly didn't recognize my name when I reached out. The scientific journals that had once competed to publish my research began rejecting my submissions without peer review, citing concerns about methodology that were really concerns about association with a controversial figure. I watched from the sidelines as other researchers began to explore stem cell therapy, carefully avoiding any mention of my pioneering work. Some of them reached out privately, telling me they admired what I'd done but couldn't publicly support me without risking their own careers. Others simply took my published research, modified it slightly, and presented it as their own original work. The financial pressure was crushing. My savings from my Stanford salary evaporated within 6 months. I sold my car, downgraded my apartment twice, and eventually took out loans just to cover basic living expenses. My parents, who had immigrated from South Korea and sacrificed everything to put me through medical school, were devastated to see me struggling after achieving so much success. "Why did you do it?" my mother asked during one of our weekly phone calls. "You had everything. Why risk it all for one patient?" I tried to explain that watching someone die when you know you can save them isn't really a choice at all. But she'd come from a culture that valued stability and respect for authority, and she couldn't understand why I'd thrown away a prestigious career for principle. The loneliness was worse than the financial hardship. I'd spent my entire adult life immersed in academic medicine, surrounded by colleagues who shared my passion for research and innovation. Suddenly, I was isolated from that world, watching it continue without me while I worked in a community clinic where nobody cared about cellular regeneration or cardiac research breakthroughs. But I kept documenting everything, every detail of Jennifer Zhao's recovery, every follow-up scan showing continued improvement, every measurement of her cardiac function. I knew the data was solid. I knew the treatment worked. And I believed that eventually the medical community would have to acknowledge what I'd accomplished, even if they refused to acknowledge me personally. I went from being the youngest department head at a prestigious medical center to being an unemployable pariah in my own field, surviving on consulting fees that barely covered rent. But something interesting was happening in the wider medical community. Other researchers had read my papers about the stem cell treatment. Some of them, working at universities and research hospitals around the world, began their own investigations into cardiac regeneration therapy. The first breakthrough came from a team at the University of Tokyo. Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka had been following my case closely and believed my approach had merit despite the controversy. He spent 18 months securing approval for clinical trials using a modified version of my protocol. His results, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, showed a 78% success rate in treating previously incurable cardiac conditions. Within months, research teams in Germany, Sweden, and Brazil were replicating the results. Each study built on my original work, refining the technique and improving the protocols. The medical establishment that had condemned me for using experimental treatment was now racing to perfect that same treatment. Dr. Tanaka was one of the few researchers who publicly acknowledged my contribution. In his paper's introduction, he wrote, "This work builds directly on the pioneering research of Dr. Sarah Kim, whose courageous application of stem cell therapy in a clinical emergency demonstrated the viability of this approach." That single sentence in a prestigious journal did more to rehabilitate my reputation than 2 years of my own advocacy. Other researchers weren't as generous. I watched papers published by teams at Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, and UCLA that clearly used my methodology without citation. They called it novel cardiac regeneration protocols, or innovative stem cell applications, carefully avoiding any mention of where the innovation had actually originated. Stanford published a comprehensive study on cardiac stem cell therapy that included none of my original research in the bibliography, despite the fact that I'd developed the core protocol while employed there. They claimed institutional ownership of my work while continuing to distance themselves from me personally. The irony was painful, but not surprising. Academic medicine has always been better at claiming credit for breakthroughs than acknowledging the researchers who made them possible, especially when those researchers had become inconvenient. They refined my technique, improved the protocol, and eventually received approval to begin clinical trials. And the results were extraordinary. Within 5 years, stem cell cardiac therapy had become the standard treatment for previously incurable heart conditions. Hundreds of patients who would have died were surviving with complete recoveries. The treatment I developed was being taught in medical schools, used in hospitals worldwide, and saving thousands of lives every year. My name was rarely mentioned in the academic literature. Stanford claimed credit for the initial research, since I'd developed the treatment while employed there. Other researchers published papers building on my work without acknowledging my contribution. The medical establishment that had destroyed my career for using experimental treatment was now celebrating that same treatment as a revolutionary breakthrough. But I didn't care about credit or recognition. I cared that people were surviving. Every patient who received stem cell therapy was proof that what I'd done was right, even if it had cost me everything. Then, 7 years after I was fired, I received an email that changed everything. Dear Dr. Kim, on behalf of the Nobel Committee for Physiology or Medicine, I am pleased to inform you that you have been selected as one of this year's Nobel laureates for your groundbreaking work in cellular regeneration and cardiac tissue repair. I read the email 3 times before I believed it was real. The Nobel Prize, the highest honor in medicine, for the work that had destroyed my career. The award cited my pioneering research in stem cell therapy and her courageous application of regenerative medicine in a clinical setting, which has saved thousands of lives and fundamentally changed our understanding of cardiac disease treatment. The Nobel Committee had done what the medical establishment wouldn't. They acknowledged that saving Jennifer Zhao's life with experimental treatment had been the right decision, even though it violated every regulation designed to prevent exactly what I'd done. The announcement sent shockwaves through the medical community. Stanford Medical Center issued a statement congratulating me, while carefully avoiding any mention of why I no longer worked there. Dr. Wellington, the chief medical officer who had fired me, claimed in interviews that he'd always supported my research. Colleagues who had watched silently while I was escorted from the building suddenly remembered how they'd admired my work. The California Medical Board quietly closed their investigation and restored my license without comment. Hospitals that had rejected my applications began offering positions. Stanford even suggested I might want to return to lead their cardiac research department. I declined every offer. Instead, I used the Nobel Prize money to establish my own research institute dedicated to developing treatments that regulatory agencies considered too risky, a place where innovative medicine could be practiced without bureaucratic obstruction, where saving lives mattered more than following rules. The Nobel ceremony in Stockholm was surreal. I stood on that stage in a rented gown, receiving the medal from the King of Sweden, while an audience of the world's leading scientists applauded my achievements. In the audience, I could see Jennifer Zhao and her daughters, all 3 of them crying tears of joy. Emma was now in medical school, inspired by what had happened to her mother. Lily was studying biochemistry, hoping to continue the research I'd started. During my acceptance speech, I told the truth about what had happened, about being fired for saving a life, about the years of unemployment and professional exile, about the medical establishment that had tried to destroy me for doing what doctors are supposed to do. I didn't develop stem cell cardiac therapy to win awards, I said. I developed it because patients were dying from conditions that should have been treatable. And when I had the chance to save one of those patients, I took it, even though I knew it would cost me my career. Because medicine isn't about protecting institutions or following regulations. It's about healing people. And if we lose sight of that, we've lost everything that makes us doctors. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, longer than the King's speech, longer than the ceremony protocol called for. Scientists and physicians from around the world stood and applauded not just my research, but the principle that sometimes breaking rules is the most ethical thing a doctor can do. Dr. Wellington wasn't at the ceremony. Neither were any of the hospital administrators who had voted to fire me, but many of my former colleagues from Stanford were there, and several approached me afterward to apologize for not supporting me when I needed it most. The Nobel Prize vindicated everything I'd done. It proved that the experimental treatment I'd risked everything for was exactly the breakthrough I'd believed it to be. And it sent a message to medical institutions everywhere. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing a doctor can do is play it safe. Today, stem cell cardiac therapy is standard treatment in hospitals worldwide. The technique I developed has saved more than 50,000 lives and continues to improve every year as researchers build on my initial work. Medical schools teach my case as an example of how innovation sometimes requires courage to challenge established norms. Jennifer Zhao is still playing violin with the San Francisco Symphony. Her daughters both became doctors, dedicating their careers to regenerative medicine. And I continue my research at the institute I founded, pushing the boundaries of what medical science can achieve. Looking back on that night in the emergency room, I don't regret anything. Not the decision to use experimental treatment, not the cost to my career, not the years of exile from academic medicine. Because every time I see another patient survive because of stem cell therapy, I know that being fired for innovation was the price of progress. Medicine doesn't advance by following rules. It advances when doctors are brave enough to break them for the right reasons. And the Nobel Prize on my desk is proof that history judges us not by how well we followed protocols, but by how many lives we saved along the way. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs in medicine come from doctors who care more about saving lives than protecting their careers. Dr. Sarah Kim's story proves that innovation requires courage, that doing what's right isn't always legal, and that sometimes the people who are called reckless today become the Nobel laureates of tomorrow. Because in the end, medicine isn't about following rules. It's about healing people, even when the system says you shouldn't. What if the most important rule in medicine is knowing when to break the rules? What if saving one life illegally is more ethical than letting thousands die legally? Sometimes being right means being wrong according to everyone else, and history only proves you correct after you've lost everything.